Welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi, a board-certified music therapist. Join me each week as a new guest from across the fine and creative arts spheres shares struggles, triumphs, laughs, words of wisdom, and more in authentic, thought-provoking, and inspiring interviews. Before we begin this episode, we want to provide a content warning for our listeners. This interview features an Israeli-American author discussing her historical fiction book, which delves into events and themes tied to the complex history of the region. We recognize that this topic is dearly personal and sensitive for many, including Palestinian listeners. We aim to approach this conversation with care and respect, understanding the diverse perspectives and lived experiences tied to this history. Our goal is to provide a platform for thoughtful discussion while acknowledging that no single narrative can fully capture the complexity of these events. If you find this topic challenging, we encourage you to engage as you feel comfortable. Thank you for listening. Hello and welcome to Creative Piecemeal. I'm Tammy Takeishi. Today I'm joined by author Zeeva Bukai. She has a debut historical fiction out called The Anatomy of Exile. It just came out back in January of this year from Delphinium Books. It is shimmering with insight and compassion as it moves between scenes set in Israel and Brooklyn, New York, set in the 1960s and 1970s. Her book, The Anatomy of Exile, explores the impact of social and political turmoil on identity, love stories, marriages, and family life, as well as the ways we define home. Zeeva was born in Israel and raised in New York City. Her honors include a fellowship at the New York Center for Fiction and residencies at Hedgebrook and Byrdcliff Artist-in-Residence program. And her stories are forthcoming in the anthology Smashing the Tablets, a radical retelling of the Hebrew Bible, and have appeared in Carve Magazine, Pithead Chapel, the Lilith anthology Frankly Feminist, Stories by Jewish Women, December Magazine, where her story The Abandoning, an early version of the first chapter of her novel, was selected, and more. To learn more about Zeeva and to purchase her books, please make sure to check the show notes at the end. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Tammy. Thank you so much for inviting me.
It is an absolute pleasure. I would love to get started with what inspired you not only to become an author, but to write this particular story as your debut.
I think I wanted to become an author from the time that I was about 13 years old, but then veered off into theater, into acting, and did that a little bit. And then once I had a young family, I began writing again and really devoted myself to becoming a writer. This particular novel, I worked 10 years on this novel, and it took me that long to kind of really learn how to do it. And also, I was bringing up a young family. I put my kids through college, and by the time all of that was done, I had time to really sit down with this novel and finish it. As I said, it took me 10 years. I was inspired by the fact that I was born in Israel. My family was from Israel. There are things in this novel that are like stories that I grew up on. I decided to place the novel between 1967 and 73 because I think that those were two seminal wars in Israeli history and in Middle Eastern history. And I wanted to explore a few things. I wanted to explore a marriage between an Ashkenazi woman and a Mizrahi or Arab Jew man. And I wanted to explore cross-cultural, even more cross-cultural love affairs between Palestinians and Israelis. And the immigrant experience, which was something that I knew well. So kind of taking that immigrant experience, much of the story, even though it begins in Israel and ends there, kind of as bookends, the way the wars are bookend the narrative, the bulk of the story takes place in the US, in New York, and explores the idea of what does home mean? What does identity mean? What do we take with us? What does exile mean? Is it metaphysical? Is it emotional? Is it a physical state? And by the end of writing this book, I realized it is all of those things. Exile is both a mental state and a physical, and can be a physical state as well.
It sounds like your book brings up a lot of really important topics. What kind of reception are you hoping, or maybe not even reception is the right word, but what What are you hoping is one of the takeaways people get from reading your book?
I hope, well, so two things, that tolerance and compassion is the only way forward for us to be able to survive, I believe, especially in such a contentious area as Israel-Palestine. So that's one of the things that I want people to take away. There was a review out by Sarah Littman where she says at the end of the review, she said that the book is an antidote to the crisis that we're in now.
Mm.
And that is really what I am hoping for, that the book kind of ends with some hope. I mean, the hope is a question mark, but hope is always a question mark, right? We're never sure whether what we want and what we hope for is going to come to fruition. So my, best case scenario is that people come away understanding a little bit more about the situation. What I really try to do here is write a nuanced story about a very complex situation.
Mhm.
This is not a political book. This is a book about human relationships. And I want people to understand that this is not about governments at all. This is really about everyday people who are struggling to survive, right? Struggling to hold on to something that they feel is important, and also learn how to be more compassionate and tolerant to the other.
Yeah. Did you find yourself in creating this story having any epiphanies or metamorphoses in your own life?
Well, it's interesting because the characters changed. It took a very long time for me to write this book, right? And I think probably, well, one, I'm kind of a slow writer, but the other issue is that I think I really wanted it. I was so determined to try to get it as right as possible. And what I mean by that is I wanted everyone in the story to be very human. They are all flawed. No one is a hero. No one is a villain. Every character here has, every character here is in a situation that is difficult. How do you step out of a difficult situation with your humanity intact? What do you have to learn about yourself and about the other person in order to live in a way that feels fully human and live in a way that takes into consideration that I am hurting, but I can see that you are hurting too. It was important for me in the book that we have each side kind of acknowledging, and most especially my main character, Tamar, acknowledging that I've caused you pain and I am in pain, right? So, this acknowledgement that we can cause each other pain, I think, is a first step to seeing the other and a first step towards a more equitable future. But we have to begin there. You can't begin, and I mean, even on the smallest level, in a relationship between two people, let alone two countries or two nations, you can't move forward until you say, I accept the fact that I have caused you pain and I am sorry for it.
Hmm.
Please accept the fact that you have caused me pain. And you want to, hopefully that person can also say that they are sorry.
Yeah.
So it's that kind of a situation that I wanted by the end of the novel, and also to have a narrative arc for Tamar. She begins one place, and because she is terrified that history is going to repeat itself, she does things in the novel that are pretty awful, but we understand why she does it. At least I hope that the reader is going to understand why she does what she does. She thinks she's saving her daughter, and yet she has to learn tolerance. And that's basically her narrative arc, that by the end of the novel, she does that.
I was wondering, did you have to do any historical research for this?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
If you've been feeling burned out, stressed, overwhelmed, or exhausted, the resources and courses at the Self-Care Institute are here to support you. The Self-Care Institute was founded by Dr. Ami Kunimura and provides support for individuals and organizations with burnout prevention, burnout recovery, and stress management. I've personally taken a few of these courses and found them to be super helpful, both professionally and personally. The care you give yourself matters just as much as the care you give to others. But if self-care is difficult for you, you're not alone. And the Self-Care Institute is here to support your well-being, resilience, and sense of fulfillment at work and at home. For more information, visit selfcareinstitute.com or go to the show notes and click on the link.
I did. Well, there were a few things. First, I read about the Six-Day War and what Israel was like at that time. There was a sense of existential dread. These were many armies that were going to attack them. And the Egyptians, the Syrians, the Jordanians, first and foremost. And there was a sense of real dread. It says in the novel, I write about the fact that rabbis were sanctifying like parks in case that there would be so many deaths that they would have, and that the cemeteries would be, that there would be no more room to bury people in the cemetery. So they were literally sanctifying park grounds in order to bury the dead. That's what they believed would happen. What actually happened is that Israel won the war in 6 days with not many deaths at all. And it was a great, great victory. And there was a sense of euphoria and triumph. And then I needed to read about the 73 war, which was really the exact opposite of that. They were caught by surprise by Egypt and Syria. And it took many days for them to sort of win back their positions. But they were caught by surprise. And there was a very, very somber attitude towards the Yom Kippur War because they were caught by surprise, and over 2,600 soldiers were killed, which is, considering the smallness of most especially the population at that time, that small population, that it was a huge amount of deaths. And so I did some research about that, the two wars, and I also researched an Arab village that this Arab village in the novel, Kfar Ma'an, is based on. So I did research on that as well. But I also went through family stories. So Kfar Ma'an is based on a real Arab village. And my family was placed on that Arab village after it was abandoned. They were placed there by the Israeli government. It's kind of a long story to that. So this particular Arab village was abandoned in March of 1948. And in May 1948, Israel gets independence, it gets statehood, but at the same time, they are attacked by Egypt, Syria, Jordan. They're attacked by the surrounding Arab nations, and they're kind of fighting for their life. I mean, they hardly have an army, they hardly have anything, but they manage to kind of gain ground, and they manage to so-called win, or at least stop that particular war stops. In 1949, there are 200 mostly Mizrahi families, Jewish Mizrahi families, that are placed on that village, because now we have a lot of immigration coming into Israel post-Holocaust. There was literally no place else for these people to go. And so they all come to Israel. And they begin to come to Israel not just from Europe, but they're also coming into Israel from Arab lands, because they're being expelled. Jews are being expelled from Arab lands all through the 50s. And so all of this kind of these upheavals and immigration and all of that were things that I researched as well. And according to, going back to that Arab village, as I said, 200 Mizrahi families or Arab Jewish families were placed there and were there for quite a few years. And my family was placed there. My father was placed there, along with my aunt and uncle. And I think she gave birth to a child there, my aunt. So they were there for quite a few years. And today, that village, the name of that village was Sheikh Munis, and Tel Aviv University is built on that village. And so what the story is really about is this sense of these layers of history that you find in Israel. Because before that village, which was close to Tel Aviv and Jaffa, there were many, many, many civilizations that were there. And the idea of all of those different histories intersecting was really fascinating to me. And then, the big question becomes like, what is home? Mm-hmm. Where is home? Whose home is it? There's all of those questions. I think they're all difficult to answer.
Were you left having more questions after writing the book, or like an interest in delving deeper into the history afterward?
Well, I feel, first of all, being born in Israel, that I'm part of that history. That, my father was born in Syria. He was a Jew from Syria who basically needed to escape to survive. So, and his family had been, they were from Damascus. Damascus Jews were basically Jews who, from biblical times, would go from Judea and Samaria, which they would go from Jerusalem, Judea, Israel at the time, and they were merchants, and so they would travel back and forth. This went on for millennia. Mm. So my father's family, I would imagine that after the Roman conquest and the destruction of the second Jewish temple in Jerusalem, those families were pushed out into many, many different places. Many people were enslaved by the Romans and then brought into Europe, and then others went into places like what today is known as Syria, Lebanon, all of those areas. I'm certainly not an expert in the history, but I feel that is history that I basically grew up on. I mean, that, my family was from there. I have my Syrian, cousins, my father's cousins lived in Haifa, from the turn of the century. My grandfather would go, this was under the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, and my grandfather would go from Damascus to work in Haifa. So there was a train that went, from one place to the other. This, I feel like this is my lived history in some way, and then immigrating to America, right? So in that sense, again, these are both stories and ideas and concepts that I, grew up with. Yes, I continue. So to go back to your question, do I feel like I need to delve into the history? Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that what I hope I have come to was this idea of the compassion that I feel for everybody in this situation. This is not an easy situation, but there are realities on the ground. The partition plan was for a Palestinian state and for a Jewish state. The Jews said yes. The Palestinians, they said absolutely not. And we're still in that, everything that happened back then, we still feel the reverberations of today. Now, are there things that are more nuanced? Absolutely. Were there wars, like these small battles between Palestinians and Jews at the time, even before Israel became a state? There were. The history is long and it is very nuanced. And I feel that everybody has a stake in it. Mm-hmm. And it's such a complicated situation. It really is. It kind of breaks my heart. Everything that's happening today absolutely breaks my heart. Yeah. For both Israelis and Palestinians. And I think we've gotten into situations here that are so, it's hard to see the light. Mm. Things feel very hopeless.
Yeah, very heavy, very complex.
Yes, yeah. And the thing is that it's living out history, right? It's living out history.
Definitely seems like your book is coming out at just the right time. Perhaps it will help people see a different mindset, or, have a change of heart, or understand their neighbor better or something, or break away barriers and stereotypes that maybe they didn't know they held. Or just gain more knowledge. Like, I grew up in the Midwest in a traditional Christian family. Like, all of this is sort of a newer thing for me to learn as I got, became an adult and educated and, moved to a more metropolitan area and things of that nature. So it's, I don't have that knowledge base that a lot of people from those certain ethnic backgrounds and specific cultures have.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the issues today is the fact that people do not know the history, and that if you're looking at the history, you can say that this one is at fault or that one is at fault. And my feeling is at some point, you have to stop blaming the other and you have to start acknowledging that we cannot go on like this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, accountability, taking responsibility,
Exactly.
to repair things and be a better human.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And again, your book deals with the love story, but it deals with like important and intense and heavy topics. Was there any sections or scenes or anything that, again, without giving away spoilers, that you felt were really emotionally difficult to write, or just difficult to write from a creative writer's block aspect?
When a book takes you 10 years, there's a lot of moments where you're feeling like crippling doubt and not so much writer's block. Although I imagine that, other people might call it writer's block, but there were times where I had to kind of stop writing, think about what I really wanted, or kind of write through difficult sections. You know what I mean? So for me, in terms of my own writing process, I edit as I go. And then once I finish a scene, I kind of go back to it. So every few pages, I'll go back to the beginning and flesh it out even more, so that by the time I finish a scene, I'm like really seeing it as a more nuanced piece. I'm very jealous of people who can kind of write straight through a first draft and then go back and do a second and then their third and they're done. And that is not the way I work. I mean, I'm chiseling away at it for a long time until I get it right. There were quite a few scenes. So the scene between Hadass and Daoud. So at the beginning of the story, and I'm not giving anything away because you can read this in the synopsis, there's Tamar, who's the main character, an Ashkenazi woman married to Salim, who is a Mizrahi or Arab Jewish man from Syria. Hadass is Salim's sister, and Hadass is in love with a Palestinian man. His name is Daoud Hamid. And he lived in the village, in this particular village, Kfar Ma'an, up until 1948 when his family left. In the story, Hadass has a very long love affair with him. It goes on for about 15 years. And at the top of the story, Hadass is killed. He's killed in what we imagine is what is believed to be a terror attack, but is in fact this particular love story that goes, it's a crime of passion. It goes terribly wrong. This crime of passion is the thing that fuels, it's the catalyst that gets everything started. It's what makes Salim feel, we've got to get out of here. I don't want to be in this country anymore. I need some distance from it. And this is in the wake of the 1967 war in which he fought in. And so between the war and his sister's death and everything else, he just wants out. The difficult scenes here was I realized that I needed to flesh out the Hadass and Daoud scenes. And I wrote those much later, like at the end, when I finished the entire book, I realized I'm going to need to flesh this out. It doesn't quite work this way. And also I wanted the reader to be invested in that relationship because I wanted that relationship to be threaded throughout or haunting the entire narrative. And that's what it does. And so those Hadass Daoud scenes were difficult to write. They were painful to write because both of them are in such pain, especially Daoud. I see him as a real tragic figure here and they're all caught between history, all of them. If I think of history as kind of two blocks and we're all, kind of walking between them, right, between these layers of history, poor Daoud and Hadass are really stuck in a very, very narrow, kind of a bottleneck part of that history and can't quite get out. So those were difficult. And there were other scenes that were very difficult as well. It's an emotional book, I think. I've had friends of mine say, oh my God, I cried. I was crying here, I laughed there, but, ultimately I'm hoping it's a worthy read for my readers, for the audience.
On a more lighter note, is there something about the creative process that you really love, like a part of the creative process and writing process that you look forward to the most?
I really love writing. I mean, I know many people have like a love-hate relationship with it, and I can definitely understand that when it's not going well, it's hard to push through. I try not to think about it not going well. I just think, okay, if I rewrite this, I can somehow, if I look at it differently, I hopefully will get it to a place that feels organic and right, kind of just sits right with me. I love the process of editing, of truly kind of creating. My favorite is once I've written a scene out, I can go back to it and really begin to flesh it out. I can kind of dive deep. That diving deep is my favorite part, kind of really kind of going through it. The initial just getting the story down for me is the hardest part, right? Just kind of trying to figure out, well, what has to happen next? So that's the most difficult part. But I love the writing aspect. I mean, putting words together on a page it's like coloring,
Understandable. And yeah, getting started can be tricky sometimes. I mean, it can be exhilarating when you have a story idea, but also a little bit overwhelming because you're like, well, where's this going to go? And is it going to even pan out?
Absolutely. First of all, this story was started from a completely different point of view. It began in the point of view of Ruby. I was going to tell a kind of Romeo and Juliet story between Ruby and Faisal. Faisal is the son of the Palestinian family that moves in upstairs from Tamar and Salim's apartment. And so there is that love affair. You have these two love affairs in the story, one Daoud and Hadass. And mirroring that is the love affair between Ruby and Faisal. But I wanted to create that particular love story to mirror the first one, but hopefully have it a little more hopeful than that first one. A lot more hopeful, actually.
What book that you've read recently that has inspired you or challenged you, or that you couldn't wait to tell people about and couldn't put down?
Well, there's a couple of things that I've read recently, but Ayelet Sabari, who's an Israeli writer, Songs for the Brokenhearted, and it's about Yemenite women in Israel. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I mean, I love Ayelet's work. I've read everything that she's ever written. She's an Israeli writer who writes in English and lives in Israel. She lived in Canada for many, many years and then moved back to Israel. But her work is exquisite. So Songs for the Brokenhearted is one. I recently read Anne Brest's The Postcard, which is kind of a memoir and a retelling of what she imagines happened to people in her family during the Second World War. That was an excellent book. It was very moving and really well done. Like, there are books that I kind of go back to all the time. The Same Sea by Amos Oz, Nicole Krauss's work I love. So there are quite a few books that I either go back to and new things, of course, that I'm reading.
One way that people preserve history and family and heritage is through recipes. Is that something that, that is present in your life? Is that woven in any way? Because I have not had a chance to read Anatomy of an Exile yet, into your book at all.
So absolutely. Food is a big, big part of it. What's interesting is that you have the Mizrahi food or the Syrian foods that are in the story, like kibbeh and lahma bajin and mamul, which is a particular kind of date cookie. So there's like those foods compared to the more Ashkenazi food like schnitzel and things like that. And so food is definitely a big aspect of the book because it's where the family kind of meets, when they're eating these dinners. The fact that Hadass teaches Tamar how to cook these foods so that Salim will feel at home, right? Because food is definitely an integral part of culture, both food and music. And language, of course. And these are the things I think that permeate the novel.
Are there any particular favorite foods that you have from growing up?
I do. So my parents also had this Ashkenazi Mizrahi thing going on, and I had a combination of both of those things. My father would say that he taught my mother how to make shakshuka, how to make things like baba ganoush and tahina and things like that. So my mother was born in Siberia at the start of the Second World War, and her family were Polish, and they were deported into Siberia. And they came to Israel. I think my mother must have been about 9 years old when she came to Israel. And she also had to learn language and cuisine and, all the cultural things. And I think that when the two of them got together, you had this Ashkenazi Mizrahi thing going on. And these are very, very different cultures. How do they come together? Is it just through religious aspect? Well, my mother was never a religious person. She was always secular. My father, growing up in Syria, had a much more Jewish religious background because that's how all the Syrian Jews were, especially at that time. And so the synagogue, the temples, the kosher foods, and all of those things were really important in that community. And so, he brought that with him. And between the two of them, we ate well. So, but then we had things like lasagna, right? So
it must have created some nice personal memories for you, though, revolving around, connecting with your heritage through food.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the, friends who've been reading my book have been saying, I recognize this and I recognize that. And of course, I extrapolated from things that I know in a completely fictional way in the novel. This is definitely not a work of a memoir or anything else, but a completely fictional story.
Getting a little bit into the creative writing aspect again, what is a piece of writing advice that you always follow? And what's a piece of writing advice that you wish you knew sooner?
Coming from a theater background, I read a lot of plays and I read many novels too, but I was really focused on plays for a long period of time. When I came to fiction writing, I really had to learn how to do it because it functions very differently than a play. And actually, I took playwriting courses and I felt so mediocre writing all of that dialogue. I think what I wish I had known sooner was how to establish a scene, meaning that there needed to be rising action, a climax, and falling action. And many times I did that naturally in terms of the action of a story. I hadn't quite realized when I first began writing that I needed that narrative arc for my character, that the character has to grow. That's the part I kind of felt like, well, the character's moving through the landscape of the novel, but isn't necessarily growing. And the other thing that I learned that was very important is that try to figure out what your character wants very early on. Now, I did that for theater. You have to know what the character's objective is in order to act. But what I hadn't realized, I hadn't put together, was the idea that when you're writing fiction, you really need to understand that. You need to know what your character wants and what they're willing to do to get it. Their behavior, right? This idea of how do they behave because of the forces, the forces that are upon them. Like what are those obstacles that they need to fight against? And so it's things like that now I'm conscious of. But back then, when I first started, which was quite a long time ago, when I first started, I would just kind of write and say, oh, I'm writing this story, and things would unfold, but the character wouldn't change. And in order to really make a story come to life, we need to see that narrative arc.
Yeah, so important, so important. And I love how you talk about your experience as an actor and a playwright. Can you go a little more into that and how that filled your creative cup in life?
I started taking acting classes when I was at Tel Aviv University. And I went there for a while, and then I went to a drama conservatory also in Tel Aviv, and then came back to the US where I began, again, kind of studying theater. I loved theater because I was able to take language and bring it to life. And I was able to work with other people. And I love that community aspect, the ensemble of working in the theater. Even though you're doing a one-man show, There's the stage manager and the lighting person and, and the costume designer and the set designer. There are a lot of people that you're working with. When you're writing, unless you create a community around you, you do most of that very much alone, which is why I always encourage everybody, get a writing group together, take a workshop. It's important to have other people's feedback on your work and also for you to read other people's work. You learn what they're doing right and you learn from their mistakes. It's really difficult to fully see your own work. I always, when I finish something, I give it to beta readers to read, friends of mine. I have a workshop that I've been reading with for more than 10 or 15 years. We really encourage each other. So there's that aspect to it. But again, it's this idea of sharing the work that I think is very important. So for theater, it was hard work, but it was a lot of fun. I loved working with other actors. The seriousness with which actors come to the stage, I feel I bring that same seriousness when I'm writing. It feels like important work, even though it's just artistic and it's not Wall Street or something like that. I feel that the act of creating is very important to humanity. I think art is really important to humanity for our own growth. I think it's through art that art and memory for me go together, right? That art becomes a living object endowed with memory, with the artist's memory, whether that's in writing or in painting or in sculpture, or, you kind of bring all of yourself to the table. And it's the same thing with acting. With acting, it's this really pure form in the sense that you are using yourself, right? Your voice is an instrument. Your body is an instrument when you're an actor, the whole thing. This is what you're using. This is all you have. I feel very much that writing is close to that because it's a lot of observing of humanity, right? It's a lot of observing of the people around you, of the state of the world, societies, what people think and feel. And all of that gets filtered through you onto the page through a set of characters that you are, I'm going to use the word manipulating. And you are, because you're moving them. If you think about the page as a stage set, the character is standing next to the refrigerator one moment, and if something happens, if they hear a loud noise, they quickly rush to the other end of the room or quickly rush to the other end of the apartment, right? Or outside, or whatever the situation is. But we place characters in a scene. That's what we do. And for me, that's really exciting.
That sounds so cool. And I love the passion that you talk about, acting and playwriting. Is that something that you hope to get back into when life is a little calmer for you?
I would love to turn aspects of this book. If there's somebody out there who would turn it into a play, I'd be ecstatic. Or into a film, I'd be, a screenplay, I'd be absolutely ecstatic because I could actually see it live. In my own mind, when I'm creating a scene and when I'm writing, I have to see what everything looks like. Again, like acting, where you're using sense memory to bring something alive, mm-hmm. I use that same aspect when I'm writing. So if I'm writing about my character walking down the street and she suddenly smells jasmine from a garden, that scent is going to trigger a memory. That scent is going to trigger a feeling, a sense of longing, a sense of hopefulness, whatever that is. That, again, the nuance in writing is really important for me. And using that sense memory, having it woven through the narrative, I feel, for me anyway, it brings it alive for me. And I'm hoping that it does the same for the reader. By the way, I just want to say, talking about acting and writing, I've just written, and I'm not trying to plug this, but I've just written an article for Writer's Digest. It was posted yesterday on subtext and how to create dramatic tension through subtext. And I've used, kind of the learning that I did as an actor, as to what you have in a scene and how you bring it to life. I kind of impose that on writing itself.
Oh, nice.
So the art of subtext or subtext and the art of creating dramatic tension by focusing on what isn't said. In subtext, it's always implicit, never explicit.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're writing, you want to think about, what does the character want? How does that desire, instead of coming out in words, come out in action, come out in behavior? If you're angry with someone, how are you going to set the table, right? So that feeling colors everything that we do.
100%. 100%. That is such a great point that you bring up too. And if you can share your link, I can put it in the show notes, because I think, for budding writers, playwrights, anyone, even more seasoned writers, reading articles and being able to delve deep into that sort of thing is so important. Well, Zeeva, thank you so much for being on the show to talk about your stunning debut, Anatomy of an Exile. I can't wait to dig into it. And of course, readers, please check the show notes to purchase it, to find out more about her. Anything else you would like to say before we go?
I hope readers come away with, and I know we said this before, but I hope readers come away with this idea that we all need compassion from one another, especially in these times that are very challenging.
Yeah.
And I hope the book does that. I hope the book does that.
I think it will. It sounds like you've written it from a place of such compassion and understanding. And so, like I said, I can't wait to dig in. Can't wait for readers to dig in. And as always, check the show notes, keep listening, sharing, pre-order books, leave reviews for authors. It really makes a difference. And as always, thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Creative Piecemeal. We hope today's episode left you feeling inspired. This podcast is independently created and produced by the host, Tami Takaishi. More details about today's guest can be found in the show notes, along with links to the podcast's socials, merch store, and ways to support arts organizations AHA Broadway and New Normal Rep, both near and dear to Tami's heart. Don't forget to visit creativepiecemeal.com, the official podcast website, where you can leave fan mail, write a review, explore Tami's blog, and discover the growing collection of episodes. Special thanks to our audio engineer, Alex Rapetti. Additional narration by Dante Jace. Let's keep celebrating creativity in all its forms.